In the dusty frontier town of Dustwhistle, 1872, a giant of a man named Eli Boone builds homes with the same care most folks reserve for prayer. He's a wandering cowboy with hands like oak planks and a heart wrapped in barbed wire, man who hammers together shelter for others but never stays long enough to call anywhere home himself. When widowed schoolteacher Clara Mae Hollis hires him to build a cabin by the Willow Creek, Eli sees just another job, another reason to keep moving. But Clara sees something different in this gentle giant, something worth fighting for. As autumn turns toward winter and the cabin walls rise board by board, two wounded souls discover that sometimes the strongest foundation isn't made of timber and stone, but of trust slowly earned and love carefully built. But when Eli's dangerous past comes riding into Dustwhistle with guns drawn and debts to collect, will the shelter they've found in each other be strong enough to weather the storm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Dustwhistle, Montana territory, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. It was the kind of small frontier town that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of honest work, the steady ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wagon wheels carrying supplies from the depot, the gentle lowing of cattle being driven to market. Dustwhistle had grown around the railroad like moss around a stone, modest but persistent, populated by folks who understood that survival meant neighbors helping neighbors and that a man's word carried more weight than the silver in his pocket. Eli Boone stood 6 feet 8 inches in his worn leather boots, his broad shoulders casting their own shadow as he surveyed the lumberyard behind Murphy's General Store. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his trade inside and out. His hands, calloused from years of handling rough timber and steel tools, moved with surprising gentleness as he selected boards, running his thumb along the grain to test for hidden weaknesses that might not show for months. His sandy brown hair, touched with premature silver at the temples, fell across eyes the color of storm clouds gray-blue, and always watching, always measuring. The townspeople knew him by reputation more than acquaintance. Eli Boone was the man you hired when you needed a house built right the first time, when you couldn't afford for the roof to leak or the foundation to settle crooked. He'd drift into a town with nothing but his tools and his horse, work with a precision that bordered on artistry, collect his payment, and disappear like morning mist. Some said he'd built homesteads from the Dakotas to California, that he could raise a cabin frame in 3 days that would stand for 50 years. Others whispered darker things, that he was running from something, that a man didn't wander endless unless he had powerful reasons not to settle. What they didn't know was that Eli's wandering had worn grooves in his soul deeper than any wagon rut. He carried his father's tools in a leather satchel that had traveled more miles than most people saw in a lifetime. The hammer, saw, and square had been made by his grandfather's hands in Pennsylvania, passed down with the expectation that they'd help build something permanent, something lasting. Instead, they'd become instruments of beautiful impermanence, creating homes for others while denying Eli the very thing he crafted with such care. 3 blocks from the lumberyard, Clara Mae Hollis stood in front of the one-room schoolhouse, watching 12 children of various ages work arithmetic problems on their slate boards. At 28, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that revealed itself in layers intelligent hazel eyes that missed nothing, chestnut hair that caught sunlight like spun copper, and a smile that could coax learning from the most reluctant student. She moved through the classroom with practiced grace, her simple blue dress rustling softly as she checked each child's work, offering gentle corrections and words of encouragement. But Clara carried her own shadows. Around her neck, hidden beneath the modest collar of her dress, hung a thin gold chain. At its end rested her late husband's wedding ring, a simple band of gold that had once symbolized a future cut tragically short. Thomas Hollis had been Dustwhistle's first schoolmaster, a gentleman with dreams of bringing education to every child on the frontier. Their marriage had lasted only 2 years before a riding accident claimed his life, leaving Clara to continue his work and wrestle with the question of whether love was worth the inevitable pain of loss. The children under her care weren't just students, they were family. 8 of them were orphans, casualties of frontier life that claimed parents to disease, accident, or violence. Clara had fought the territorial authorities to keep them together, arguing that splitting them among distant relatives or sending them to institutions back east would do more harm than good. She'd won, but barely, and only with the promise that she could provide adequate housing for them all. The cramped quarters behind the schoolhouse were temporary at best, and winter was coming with the relentless certainty of frontier seasons. Miss Clara. The voice belonged to Sarah, a 10-year-old with cornflower blue eyes and hair the color of wheat. She'd been orphaned when cholera took both parents last spring, but her spirit remained unbroken. When will the new house be ready? Tommy's been coughing again, and Jenny says it's because our room gets too cold at night. Clara knelt beside Sarah's desk, her voice warm but honest. Soon, sweetheart. I've hired a builder, a very skilled man, who's going to make us a proper home by the creek. Somewhere with enough rooms for everyone, and a big fireplace to keep us all warm. She smoothed Sarah's hair gently. Mr. Boone starts work next Monday. The decision to hire Eli Boone hadn't been easy. Clara had saved every penny of her teaching salary for 2 years, supplemented by the small inheritance Thomas had left, and money earned from tutoring the merchant family's children in the evenings. She'd gotten Eli's name from the pastor, who'd heard good things from towns upriver. When she'd first seen him 3 days ago, this towering man with careful eyes, examining the building site by Willow Creek, she'd felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with finances. The land's good, Eli had said in his measured way, kneeling to test the soil with those oversized hands. Creek'll provide water year-round, and these willows will give you windbreak come winter. Foundation'll need to be stone. I can source that from the quarry outside town. You want 2 bedrooms and a main room, you said. 3 bedrooms, Clara had corrected. 2 for the children, 1 for me. And a kitchen area, if that's possible. She'd watched him make notations in a small leather notebook, his handwriting surprisingly neat for such large hands. It's possible. Good-sized root cellar too, I'd recommend. Frontier winters aren't forgiving of poor planning. He'd looked up then, those storm-grey eyes meeting hers directly. I work alone, Miss Hollis. Don't need help. Don't want supervision. I'll need 3 weeks, maybe 4 if weather turns. Half payment up front, half when you can cook your first meal in your new kitchen. The directness should have been off-putting, but something in his manner, respectful but not deferential, confident without arrogance, had reassured her. That's acceptable, Mr. Boone. When can you start? Monday next. I'll be there at first light. Now, as Clara watched her children, for that's how she thought of them, work through their lessons, she found herself wondering about the man who would build their sanctuary. There had been something in his eyes when he'd looked at the children playing by the creek, something that spoke of understanding and perhaps loss. She'd learned to read people carefully in her years of teaching and mothering orphans. Eli Boone was running from something, but she sensed it wasn't the law or debt collectors. Sometimes the things we run from live inside us, and no amount of miles can outpace them. The afternoon bell drew her from her thoughts. As the children gathered their books and slate boards, Clara noticed Jenny favoring her left foot again. The 7-year-old had injured it in the accident that claimed her parents, and the cramped quarters made it difficult for her to rest properly. Tommy's cough had indeed worsened, and little Marcus, barely 5 years old, had dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many restless nights in a bed shared with 2 other boys. Miss Clara. This time it was Ben, the oldest at 14, and the unofficial big brother to them all. Want me to walk the little ones home while you finish up here? That would be helpful, Ben. Thank you. She watched him gather the younger children with the easy authority of someone who'd grown up fast. Ben had been caring for his younger sister Emma when their parents died in a mine collapse. At 14, he had the serious demeanor of a much older boy, but Clara sometimes caught glimpses of the child he should have been allowed to remain. As the schoolhouse emptied, Clara stood at the window, watching her children walk toward their temporary home. The sight of them resilient, loving, deserving of so much more than frontier life had given them strengthened her resolve. The house by Willow Creek wasn't just a building project. It was hope made manifest in timber and stone. It was the promise that family didn't require blood, that home was something you could build with love and determination and enough faith to hire a mysterious cowboy who might just understand what shelter really meant. She touched the ring hanging beneath her dress, feeling its familiar weight. Thomas would have loved these children, would have delighted in their questions and celebrated their small victories. Building this house felt like honoring his memory while creating something newer way of moving forward without leaving love behind. Monday couldn't come soon enough. Clara Mae Hollis was ready to build a home, even if it meant trusting a man whose shadows might be deeper than her own. In a town like Dustwhistle, sometimes faith was the only foundation you could count on, and sometimes that had to be enough. Monday morning arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, frost painting delicate patterns on the schoolhouse windows. Clara rose before dawn, her breath visible in the chilly air as she prepared breakfast for her children. The excitement in their voices as they discussed the coming construction made her smile despite her own nervousness about the day ahead. Eli Boone arrived at the building site, precisely at first light, just as he'd promised. Clara watched from the schoolhouse window as he unloaded his tools from a sturdy pack horse, each implement placed with methodical care on a canvas tarp. Even from a distance, she could see the reverence with which he handled his equipment. These weren't just tools to him, but trusted companions that had helped him create homes across half the territory. When the morning lessons concluded, Clara walked her children to the creek site to witness the beginning of their new life. The spot she'd chosen sat on a gentle rise overlooking the water, surrounded by graceful willows that would provide shade in summer and windbreak in winter. Eli had already begun marking the foundation lines with wooden stakes and string, creating a precise rectangle that seemed larger than she'd imagined. "Children, this is Mr. Boone," Clara announced as they approached. "He's going to build our new home." Eli straightened from his work, removing his worn hat in a gesture of respect that seemed automatic. Up close, Clara noticed details she'd missed during their previous meeting, the careful mending on his shirt, the way his eyes softened when they landed on the children, the slight hesitation before he spoke, as if he was out of practice with casual conversation. "Ma'am, children." His voice carried the measured cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "You'll want to stay clear of the work area, but you're welcome to watch from over by that big willow. Building a house is something worth seeing, I reckon." Sarah, ever the bold one, stepped forward. "Are you really going to make it big enough for all of us?" "That's the plan, little miss. 3 bedrooms, big kitchen, proper fireplace for those Montana winters." Eli crouched down to Sarah's level, his massive frame somehow becoming less intimidating. "What's most important to you in a house?" The question sparked an animated discussion among the children. Jenny wanted a window in every room so she could see the creek. Tommy hoped for a loft where he could read without bothering anyone. Emma wished for a kitchen garden plot. Ben, practical as always, asked about the root cellar and winter food storage. Clara watched in amazement as Eli listened to each request with genuine attention, occasionally asking follow-up questions or making small sketches in his notebook. This wasn't the gruff, solitary man she'd expected. There was kindness in his careful attention to their dreams and wisdom in the way he explained which wishes were possible and which might need adjustment. "What about you, Miss Hollis?" Eli asked, rising to his full height. "What does home mean to you?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on practical need shelter, warmth, space, that she hadn't considered the deeper meaning. "Safety," she said finally. "A place where they can be children without worrying about tomorrow. Where we can be a family." Something shifted in Eli's expression, a flicker of recognition or perhaps longing that passed so quickly she almost missed it. "That's the most important foundation of all," he said quietly. As the children reluctantly returned to afternoon lessons, Clara lingered at the site. Eli had begun the careful work of excavating the foundation, his movements efficient and practiced. She found herself mesmerized by the rhythm of his work, the precise measurement, the careful removal of soil, the way he tested each corner for level and square. "Mr. Boone," she ventured, "how long have you been building homes?" He paused, leaning on his shovel. "Since I was old enough to hold a hammer steady. Learned from my father, who learned from his father before him. It's good work, honest work. But you don't stay to see people enjoy what you've built." The observation hung in the air between them. Eli's hands tightened slightly on the shovel handle, and Clara worried she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. "Houses are for staying," he said finally. "I'm better at moving." Before Clara could respond, little Marcus came running from the schoolhouse, tears streaming down his face. "Miss Clara, Jenny fell down and she can't get up." Clara rushed to the schoolhouse, Eli close behind her despite her protests that he needn't trouble himself. They found Jenny sitting on the classroom floor, her injured foot twisted beneath her, trying to be brave but clearly in pain. "I was just trying to reach the high shelf," Jenny whispered. "I wanted to put the arithmetic books away to help Miss Clara." Without hesitation, Eli knelt beside the child. "May I take a look at that foot, little one? I've had some experience with injuries." His hands, so large they could span Jenny's entire leg, examined her ankle with extraordinary gentleness. "Nothing broken, I think, but you've given it a good twist. You'll need to stay off it for a few days." Before Clara could protest, Eli scooped Jenny into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "Where does she sleep?" "In the back room with the other girls," Clara said, leading the way to their cramped quarters behind the schoolhouse. As Eli carefully settled Jenny onto a narrow cot, Clara noticed him taking in the conditioned state, children sharing 3 small rooms, inadequate ventilation, barely enough space to move around. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The new house," he said quietly to Clara as they stepped back into the main room. "How soon do you need it finished?" "We discussed 3 to 4 weeks. I mean, how soon do you really need it? Before the first hard freeze?" Clara looked at the worry in his eyes, then back at Jenny trying to get comfortable on her thin mattress, at Tommy's persistent cough, at all of them crowded into spaces meant for half their number. "Yes," she admitted, "before the first hard freeze." Eli nodded once, decisively. "Then we'd better get started." He returned to the foundation site and worked until well past sunset, the sound of his tools carrying across the town. Clara found herself glancing out the window repeatedly, watching his silhouette against the fading light. There was something almost desperate in his intensity, as if building this house had become more than just a job, as if it had become a mission. When she finally brought him a plate of dinner and a cup of coffee, he accepted them with quiet gratitude, but didn't stop working. "Mr. Boone, you'll exhaust yourself at this pace. These children need a proper home," he said, not looking up from the foundation stones he was carefully positioning. "Winter doesn't wait for convenient timing." Clara watched him work in the lamplight, noting the precision with which he placed each stone, testing and adjusting until the fit was perfect. His measuring stick, a piece of worn wood, marked with notches and numbers, never left his hand. She realized this wasn't just about building a house anymore. Something in their first day together, in the children's dreams and Jenny's injury, and the overcrowded rooms behind the schoolhouse, had changed the nature of this project for both of them. As she walked back to the schoolhouse, Clara touched the ring beneath her dress and whispered a small prayer to Thomas. She'd asked for a builder, but perhaps what she'd found was something more, a man who understood that home wasn't just about walls and roof, but about the sacred act of creating shelter for those who needed it most. The foundation stones Eli was laying so carefully would support more than timber and shingles. They would be the bedrock of a new beginning, the place where wounded hearts might finally find the courage to trust again. The first week of construction established a rhythm that surprised Clara with its comfort. Each morning, Eli arrived at dawn and worked steadily until evening, pausing only when she brought him meals or when one of the children couldn't resist asking questions about his techniques. What had begun as polite interaction slowly deepened into something warmer conversations that lingered longer than necessity required, shared smiles over the children's antics, moments of comfortable silence that spoke of growing ease in each other's company. Clara found herself looking forward to these daily encounters with an anticipation that both pleased and unsettled her. She'd grown accustomed to the solitary nature of her life, finding fulfillment in teaching and caring for her children without expecting anything more. But watching Eli work with such obvious skill and dedication, seeing his gentle patience with Jenny's questions and Ben's offers to help, awakened longings she'd thought safely buried with Thomas. On Thursday morning, she approached the building site, carrying a covered basket, and found Eli studying a section of the foundation with unusual intensity. The morning frost had been heavier than usual, and she noticed he'd wrapped his hands around a cup of coffee, as if trying to warm them. The temperature dropped more than expected last night, Clara observed, setting down her basket. I brought extra biscuits and some of Mrs. Henderson's honey butter. She insisted when I mentioned you were working such long hours. Eli accepted the additional food with a nod of gratitude. Kind of her. Small towns have their virtues. He gestured toward the foundation. The cold's actually helping. Mortar sets better when it cures slowly, makes for stronger joints. Your house will stand long after we're both gone. The casual reference to their eventual absence created an unexpected pang in Clara's chest. Will you stay to see it finished, or will you move on once the walls are up? I finish what I start, Miss Hollis. That's a promise I make to every client. His grey eyes met hers briefly before returning to his work. Besides, these children deserve to see their home completed properly. As if summoned by the mention of them, Sarah and Emma appeared from the direction of the schoolhouse, their morning chores completed early. Miss Clara says we can watch if we stay behind the rope line, Sarah announced importantly. Eli had strung a rope around the work area after Ben had nearly stepped on a board bristling with nails. The children respected the boundary religiously, but their fascination with the construction process was evident in their daily migration to the big willow tree that had become their observation post. What are you doing now, Mr. Boone? Emma asked, her 7-year-old curiosity undaunted by the early hour. Laying the cornerstone, Eli replied, hefting a large, perfectly squared piece of granite. This one stone has to be exactly right, because everything else builds from here. If the cornerstone is true, the whole house will be strong. Clara watched him position the stone with meticulous care, using his measuring stick to check multiple angles before declaring himself satisfied. There was something almost ceremonial about the process, as if he understood the symbolic weight of what he was creating. Mr. Boone, Sarah said thoughtfully, when you were little, did someone build you a house like this? The question seemed to catch Eli off guard. His hands stilled on the stone, and Clara saw a shadow cross his features. My father built our house with his own hands, he said after a moment. Good, solid construction, still standing far as I know. Don't you want to go see it? Emma pressed with the innocent directness of childhood. Sometimes the places we come from aren't the places we belong, Eli said gently. But that doesn't make the building any less important. Clara sent the girls back to their lessons with a meaningful look, sensing that Eli's past held complicated truths he wasn't ready to share. As she helped him organize his tools for the day's work, she found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw, the careful way he handled everything, the unconscious precision of his movements. The children are growing quite fond of you, she said carefully. Ben especially. I think he sees you as someone to look up to. Ben's a good boy, carries too much responsibility for his age, but that's frontier life. He'll make a fine man. Eli selected a chisel from his tool roll, testing its edge against his thumb. They're lucky to have you looking after them. We look after each other. That's what families do. Clara arranged the morning's biscuits on a clean cloth. Even families that aren't bound by blood. Sometimes those are the strongest kind, Eli murmured, almost to himself. The comment revealed more than Clara suspected he'd intended. She began to understand that Eli's wandering might not be driven by restlessness, but by loss, that perhaps he understood chosen families because he'd been denied the traditional kind. As the morning progressed, Clara found herself inventing reasons to linger at the construction site. She brought fresh water when his bucket ran low, consulted him about the placement of windows, even helped hold boards while he marked measurements. Her recipe book, a treasured collection inherited from her mother and grandmother, lay open on a makeshift table where she'd been copying down meal plans for the new kitchen. "That's quite a collection," Eli observed during a break, nodding toward the book. "Some of those recipes look old." 4 generations of family cooking, Clara confirmed with pride. "My great-grandmother brought some of these from Virginia when she was barely 18. Others were learned from neighbors and friends along the way. Each recipe tells a story." Eli studied the careful handwriting that filled the pages, different inks and scripts, marking the passage of years and hands. "Must be comforting, having that connection to the past." "It is. When I cook my grandmother's cornbread or my mother's apple preserves, I feel like they're still with me in some way." Clara traced one of the faded entries with her finger. "Thomas used to say that food was love made visible, that feeding people was one of the purest ways to show you cared about them." The mention of her late husband created a moment of awkward silence. Clara immediately regretted bringing up Thomas, worried that it might make Eli uncomfortable. But when she glanced at him, she saw only gentle understanding in his expression. "He sounds like a wise man," Eli said simply. "The children are lucky to have inherited that kind of love." Something in his tone wistful, rather than pitying, encouraged Clara to continue. "He would have loved seeing this house built. Thomas believed every child deserved a room of their own, a place where they could dream without fear." She closed the recipe book carefully. "I like to think he'd approve of what we're creating here." "I'm sure he would," Eli said with quiet conviction. "A man who understood love would want the people he cared about to find happiness again." The conversation was interrupted by the lunch bell from the schoolhouse. As Clara gathered her things, she noticed Eli watching the children stream out of the building with an expression she couldn't quite read, longing mixed with something that might have been sadness. "Mr. Boone, will you join us for lunch today? The children have been asking, and I always cook too much anyway." For a moment, she thought he might accept. But then that familiar wariness returned to his eyes, the careful distance she was beginning to recognize as his default response to kindness. "Thank you, but I prefer to work through the midday, lose momentum otherwise." Clara nodded, hiding her disappointment. "Of course. I'll leave a plate for you to eat when you're ready." As she walked back toward the schoolhouse, she heard the steady rhythm of his hammer resume behind her. Eli Boone was building them a beautiful home, with skill and dedication that exceeded anything she could have hoped for. But Clara was beginning to suspect that what he was really building was a wall around his own heart-own that might prove harder to breach than any foundation he'd ever laid. By the second week, the cabin walls had begun to rise with impressive speed. Eli worked with the focused intensity of a man racing against time, though Clara couldn't understand his urgency. Winter was still weeks away, and the foundation work had proceeded ahead of schedule. What she didn't know was that each morning brought Eli a growing sense of dread, not about the weather, but about his own deepening attachment to this place and these people. His worn leather tool belt had become a familiar sight around the construction area, the leather darkened with years of honest sweat and careful use. Clara had noticed how he touched it sometimes, almost unconsciously, running his fingers along the smooth spots where tools had rested for countless hours. When she'd asked about it one morning, his response had been characteristically brief but revealing. "Belonged to my father, and his father before him. Been building houses for 3 generations with these tools." He'd adjusted the belt's position with unconscious habit. "Only thing I own that's traveled every mile with me." The admission had given Clara insight into the man beneath the careful reserve. Eli Boone wasn't running from his past, so much as carrying it with him, the weight of family legacy and the burden of being the last in a line of builders who'd always stayed long enough to see their communities grow. On Tuesday morning, Clara approached the building site to find Eli teaching Ben how to properly join 2 pieces of timber. The 14-year-old was struggling with the technique, his young hands not yet strong enough to control the large tools. But Eli's patience was extraordinary. "Easy there, son. Let the tool do the work. Your job is to guide it, not force it." Eli's large hands covered Ben's on the chisel handle, demonstrating the proper angle. "Feel how the grain wants to split. Work with it, not against it." Clara paused at the rope line, watching this impromptu lesson with growing warmth. Ben had been without a father figure for over a year, and his hunger for masculine guidance was evident in the way he absorbed every word Eli spoke. "Why do you check it so many times?" Ben asked as Eli used his measuring stick to verify the joint for the 4th time. "Because mistakes in building are like lies, they get harder to fix the longer you leave them." Eli handed Ben the measuring stick, encouraging him to check the work himself. "My grandfather used to say that a house remembers every shortcut you take. Better to spend time getting it right than years living with what's wrong." Ben ran the stick along the joint with careful concentration, mimicking Eli's precise movements. "It's perfect," he announced with pride. "Near perfect," Eli corrected gently. "But near perfect is good enough for an apprentice. You'll get the hang of it." Clara stepped forward, no longer content to simply observe. "Ben, shouldn't you be helping with morning chores?" "I finished early, Miss Clara. Mr. Boone said if I wanted to learn, he'd teach me properly." Ben's face glowed with enthusiasm. "Did you know that different woods have different personalities? Oak is stubborn but strong, pine is forgiving but soft, and cedar practically builds itself if you listen to what it wants to do. Mr. Boone, you don't need to take time from your work to—" "Boy's got good hands and a good head," Eli interrupted. "Shame to waste that. Besides, an extra pair of hands speeds things along, provided they're guided right." As Ben returned to the schoolhouse for his regular lessons, Clara found herself alone with Eli for the first time in days. The walls had risen high enough that they formed actual rooms now, and she could begin to envision the reality of their future home. "He looks up to you," she said, watching Ben's retreating figure. "I hope you know what that means to him." Eli continued working, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Boy needs someone to teach him proper skills. Won't always be someone around to do it." The comment stung more than Clara expected. "Won't always be someone around? You mean you won't always be around?" "I finished the job, Miss Hollis. That's what I promised, and that's what I'll do. But after that," he shrugged, the gesture more telling than words. "And after that, you disappear, like you always do." Clara surprised herself with the edge in her voice. "Ben doesn't understand that. None of the children do. They think you might stay." Eli's hammer stilled in his hand. "I never gave them reason to think that." "You didn't have to. You gave them attention, patience, kindness. Children don't understand the difference between temporary affection and permanent commitment. They just know someone cares about them. And that's a bad thing?" Clara stepped closer, studying his profile. "It is if you plan to break their hearts." For a long moment, they stood facing each other across the foundation of what would become the children's new home. Clara could see the conflict in Eli's expression, genuine care for her children, warring with whatever drove him to keep moving. "I don't break hearts intentionally," he said finally. "That's why I don't stay long enough for anyone to get attached." "Too late for that, don't you think?" Before Eli could respond, the sound of voices approached from the schoolhouse. Clara quickly busied herself arranging the lunch she'd brought, but the tension between them remained palpable. Sarah and Emma arrived, carrying a mason jar filled with creek water and wild flowers, her daily gift they'd begun bringing to brighten up the work area. Behind them walked Jenny, still favoring her injured foot, but determined to participate in the construction observation. "Look, Mr. Boone," Sarah announced proudly. "We picked the purple ones you said were called lupines." Jenny found a whole patch down by the water. Eli accepted the flowers with solemn courtesy, placing the jar on his makeshift workbench where it caught the morning sun. "That's mighty thoughtful. Nothing makes a worksite prettier than flowers picked by careful hands." Clara watched this exchange with growing understanding. Eli might claim to be emotionally distant, but his actions told a different story. He remembered their names acknowledged their small gifts, answered their endless questions with patience that exceeded that of most fathers. Whether he admitted it or not, he was already invested in these children, and they in him. "Mr. Boone," Jenny said quietly, settling herself carefully on a nearby stump, "when the house is finished, will you build the furniture too?" "I could build some basic pieces," Eli replied, not looking at Clara. "Beds, table, chairs, nothing fancy, but solid." "What about a rocking chair?" Emma asked hopefully. "Miss Clara used to have one, but it got broken when we moved to the schoolhouse." "I could manage a rocking chair," Eli said softly. "Every proper home needs one." Clara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. The rocking chair had been Thomas's surprise for their first anniversary, a beautiful piece he'd commissioned from a craftsman in Helena. She'd sold it, along with most of their other possessions, when finances grew tight after his death. She'd told herself it was just furniture, but the loss had felt like giving away another piece of their shared life. "That's very kind of you," she managed, "but you've already done so much." "Kindness is free, Miss Hollis, and these children deserve every comfort we can provide." The afternoon passed quietly, with Clara grading papers in the shade while the children played, and Eli worked steadily on the walls. But his earlier words kept echoing in her mind. "Won't always be someone around." The casual way he spoke of leaving as if it were inevitable rather than chosen revealed more about his character than he probably intended. As evening approached, and the children returned to the schoolhouse for dinner preparation, Clara lingered at the construction site. Eli was cleaning his tools with the same meticulous care he brought to every aspect of his work, each implement wiped clean and returned to its proper place in the leather roll. "Mr. Boone, may I ask you something personal?" He glanced up, wariness flickering in his grey eyes. "You can ask. When you leave here, when you finish the house and move on, do you ever think about the families whose homes you've built? Do you wonder how they're doing?" Eli was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a murmur. "Every day, every single day." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Clara wasn't sure she had the courage to cross. But before she could respond, Eli had gathered his tools and was walking toward his horse, leaving her standing alone among the rising walls of what would soon be home. That night, as Clara helped the children with their evening routines, she found herself watching Eli's small campfire through the window. He sat alone beside it, occasionally tending the flames, but mostly just staring into the darkness beyond. She wondered what memories haunted those quiet hours, what regrets drove a man to build homes for others, while denying himself the very thing he created with such skill and love. The third week brought an unexpected shift in the town's perception of Eli Boone. Word had spread about his patient teaching of Ben, his gentle way with the children, and the remarkable quality of his work. Women began stopping by the construction site to chat with Clara and steal glances at the mysterious builder. Men paused to examine his techniques and offer grudging admiration for his craftsmanship. What had begun as idle curiosity gradually transformed into something approaching acceptance, a rare commodity for a drifter in a small frontier town. Clara noticed the change most clearly on Wednesday morning, when Mrs. Henderson from the mercantile arrived, carrying a basket of fresh bread and a thermos of coffee. "For Mr. Boone," she announced with a maternal smile. "Man working that hard needs proper nourishment. And Clara, dear, I wanted you to know that Harold's been watching the construction from the shop window. Says he's never seen finer joinery work, even from the carpenters who built the railroad depot." Eli accepted the gift with his characteristic quiet courtesy, but Clara could see his discomfort with the attention. He'd grown accustomed to being invisible in the towns where he worked hired, paid, forgotten. The genuine warmth of Dustwhistle's residence seemed to unsettle him more than their initial suspicion had. The change in the children was even more pronounced. What had started as curious observation had evolved into genuine affection. They brought him small treasures, interesting rocks, pressed flowers, drawings of the house in progress. Most touching of all was the wooden toy horse that had appeared on his workbench Tuesday morning, carved with painstaking care by young Marcus. "I made it for you," the 5-year-old had announced proudly. "Miss Clara says you don't have any toys, and everyone should have at least one." Clara had watched Eli examine the crude but heartfelt carving, his large fingers tracing the uneven lines with extraordinary gentleness. The emotion that flickered across his features, surprise, gratitude, something deeper that might have been longing had, revealed more about his character than weeks of conversation. "This is the finest horse I've ever seen," Eli had told Marcus with complete sincerity. "I'll treasure it always." Now the little wooden horse occupied a place of honor on Eli's tool chest, carefully wrapped in soft cloth each evening and unwrapped each morning. Clara had caught him looking at it several times, his expression thoughtful and perhaps a little sad. On Thursday afternoon, as Clara graded arithmetic papers in the shade of the willow tree, she became aware of raised voices from town. Pastor Morrison appeared on the path to the building site, his usually calm demeanor marked by obvious agitation. "Clara, my dear, I need to speak with you privately." He glanced toward Eli, who was installing window frames with his usual precision. "Perhaps we could walk back toward the schoolhouse." Something in the pastor's tone sent warning signals through Clara's mind. "Of course. Children, please continue your reading practice. I'll be back shortly." As they walked away from the construction site, Pastor Morrison's discomfort became more apparent. "Clara, I've received some concerning information about Mr. Boone. Information I feel you should know before this project goes any further." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of information?" "A rider came through this morning, a bounty hunter named Cartwright. He's been tracking a man who matches Mr. Boone's description. Someone wanted in connection with a shooting in Wyoming territory 2 years ago." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "A shooting? Are you certain?" The description was quite specific. Very tall, sandy hair with silver at the temples, distinctive scars on his hands from carpentry work. Cartwright seemed confident he'd found his man. Clara's mind raced, trying to reconcile this information with the gentleman who carved toys for children and taught carpentry techniques with infinite patience. Did this bounty hunter speak to Eli directly? "No. He was continuing south when I spoke with him. Said he'd be back through in a few days to investigate further." Pastor Morrison's expression was kind, but troubled. "Clara, I know you've grown fond of Mr. Boone, and the children certainly have. But if there's any truth to these allegations—" "What exactly was he accused of?" Clara interrupted, surprised by the defensive edge in her own voice. "The details were vague. Something about a confrontation that left a man dead. Cartwright claimed there was a witness who could identify the shooter." Pastor Morrison touched her arm gently. "My dear, I'm not saying Mr. Boone is guilty of anything, but perhaps it would be wise to exercise caution until we know more." Clara walked back to the construction site, with her mind in turmoil. She found Eli exactly where she'd left him, methodically fitting window trim with the same careful attention to detail he brought to every aspect of the house. Watching him work those scarred hands moving with practiced skill, his concentration absolute, he found it almost impossible to imagine him involved in violence. "Mr. Boone," she called softly. He looked up, and immediately his expression changed. "Something wrong, Miss Hollis?" The concern in his voice, the way he instinctively took a step toward her, ready to help with whatever trouble had brought that look to her face, it was the reaction of a protector, not a killer. Pastor Morrison had some visitors today, men asking questions about strangers in town. Clara watched his face carefully. "Is there anything you think I should know about your past?" For a moment, Eli's features went completely still. Then a familiar wariness crept into his eyes, the look of a man who'd learned to expect the worst from other people's judgment. "There are things in every man's past he'd rather leave buried," he said carefully. "Things that might not look the same to outsiders as they did to the man who lived them. That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now." Eli set down his tools and faced her directly. But I will tell you this, I've never hurt anyone who didn't deserve hurting, and I've never harmed a child or a woman in my life. If that's not enough for you, I can be packed and gone within the hour." The offer was made without bitterness, but Clara could hear the pain beneath the resignation. This was a man accustomed to being judged and found wanting, someone who expected to be turned away when the truth about his past surfaced. "The children are very attached to you," Clara said quietly. "Ben especially. He started talking about learning carpentry as a trade, following in your footsteps. Ben's a good boy. He deserves better than to follow in my footsteps. What if those footsteps aren't as dark as you think they are?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Clara to the partially built house to the schoolhouse, where the children's voices could be heard through the open windows. "There are men looking for me," he said finally. "Men who believe I owe them something I can't pay. Staying here puts you and the children at risk. Maybe it's time I moved on before that risk becomes reality. And leave the house unfinished. Leave Ben without his teacher, and Jenny without someone who remembers to ask about her foot, and Marcus without someone who treasures his gifts." Clara stepped closer, her voice gaining strength. "Leave me without." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between them. Eli's expression softened, and for a moment Clara thought she saw something vulnerable and hopeful in his grey eyes. "Without what, Clara?" he asked softly, using her given name for the first time. Before she could answer, the sound of children's laughter drew their attention. Sarah and Emma were playing with Marcus near the willow tree, their joy and innocence a stark contrast to the heavy conversation taking place nearby. "Without someone who understands what home really means," Clara finished quietly. "Someone who builds not just with timber and stone, but with patience and kindness and care." Eli's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "You don't know everything about me. When you down everyone does, you might feel differently. Then tell me everything and let me decide for myself." For a moment, Clara thought he might accept her offer. But then that familiar wall came down behind his eyes, and she knew she'd lost him to whatever demons drove him to keep running. "I'll finish the house," he said firmly. "That's a promise I made, and I keep my word. But after that," he gestured helplessly, "after that, it's better for everyone if I move on." As Clara watched him return to his work with renewed intensity, she realized that Eli Boone wasn't just building them a house. He was building them a gift, a parting gesture designed to ease his own guilt about leaving. The thought both touched and infuriated her in equal measure. That evening, as she tucked the children into their cramped beds, Clara found herself studying each face in the lamplight. Ben, already dreaming of learning carpentry skills. Jenny, whose ankle had healed under Eli's gentle care. Marcus, who'd proudly shown everyone how Mr. Boone had taught him to whittle. All of them blissfully unaware that the man they'd come to care for was planning his departure. "Miss Clara?" Sarah's sleepy voice interrupted her thoughts. "Is Mr. Boone going to live in the new house with us?" The innocent question pierced Clara's heart. "Why would you think that, sweetheart?" "Because he's building it like he loves it, like he loves us." Sarah yawned and snuggled deeper into her thin blanket. "People who love you don't leave, do they?" Clara smoothed the child's hair, unable to find words that were both truthful and comforting. In Sarah's world, love meant permanence, safety meant staying. The harsh realities of adult choices, fear, guilt, the weight of past mistakes were beyond her understanding. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated reasons for the things they do," Clara said finally, "but that doesn't make their love any less real." As she blew out the lamp and settled into her own narrow bed, Clara stared at the ceiling and wondered if she was falling in love with a man determined to break her heart. Friday morning brought the first hard frost of the season, coating the willow trees in crystalline lace and reminding everyone that winter's approach was no longer theoretical. Clara arrived at the building site to find Eli already at work, his breath visible in the crisp air as he fitted the final pieces of roofing. The house had taken shape with remarkable speed over the past week, driven by what Clara now understood was Eli's urgent desire to complete his obligations before whatever pursued him caught up. The children gathered at their usual observation post, bundled in extra shawls and excited by the visible progress. The roof would be finished today, transforming their future home from a framework of hope into something solid and real. But Clara found it difficult to share their enthusiasm, knowing that each completed task brought Eli's departure closer. "Miss Clara, look," Ben called out, pointing to where Eli was positioning the final ridge beam. "Mr. Boone says after the roof is done, we can start thinking about the inside work. Floors and walls and built-in furniture." Clara forced a smile, unwilling to dampen Ben's excitement with her own growing dread. "That's wonderful, dear. You've been such a good helper to Mr. Boone." What she didn't mention was the letter she'd found, that morninga folded piece of paper that had been slipped under the schoolhouse door sometime during the night. The contents were brief but chilling. "We know you're here. 3 days to settle accounts, or we start asking questions around town about the woman and children you're hiding behind." The letter bore no signature, but its meaning was unmistakable. Someone had found Eli, and they were threatening not just him, but everyone he cared about. Clara had spent the dark hours before dawn, wrestling with whether to show him the letter, ultimately deciding that he deserved to know what they were facing. "Mr. Boone," she called, approaching the work area with the letter concealed in her coat pocket. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Eli climbed down from the roof framework, his expression immediately alert to the tension in her voice. "What's wrong?" Clara glanced toward the children, ensuring they were occupied with their morning games, then handed him the letter. She watched his face as he read, noting how his jaw tightened and his hands clenched slightly around the paper. "When did this come?" he asked quietly. "Sometime last night. I found it under the door this morning." Clara studied his expression, searching for signs of the fear she was feeling. Instead, she saw only a grim resignation that was somehow worse. "Eli, who are these people? What do they want from you?" He folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "They want me to pay for something I didn't do, or rather, something I did do, but not the way they think I did it." "The shooting in Wyoming?" Eli's head snapped up, surprise flickering in his gray eyes. "You know about that?" "Pastor Morrison told me." A bounty hunter came through asking questions. Clara took a step closer. "Tell me what really happened, please. These children trust you, and I—" She paused, struggling with words that felt too large and dangerous. "I need to know who you really are." For a long moment, Eli was silent, his gaze moving from the letter to the house he'd been building, to the children playing nearby. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a burden he'd been carrying alone for too long. 2 years ago, I was working in Laramie, building a house for a family named Patterson. Good Pipala widow with 2 young children, much like your situation here. He leaned against the workbench, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. There were men in that town, rough men who thought they could take what they wanted from people who couldn't fight back. They'd been pressuring Mrs. Patterson to sell her land for a fraction of what it was worth. Clara listened intently, noting the careful way Eli chose his words, the pain that flickered across his features. "The night before I was set to finish the house, 3 of them came calling, said they were done being patient, that Mrs. Patterson could sell or be forced out, but either way, they were taking the land." Eli's hands tightened into fists. "I tried to reason with them first, but when one of them put his hands on Mrs. Patterson's daughter, a girl no older than your Sarah, reasoning stopped being enough." "What did you do?" "What any decent man would do. I stopped them." Eli met her eyes directly. "One of them drew on me. I was faster. He died, and the other 2 ran." The simple words carried years of guilt and regret. Clara began to understand the weight Eli carried, the reason he couldn't seem to stay in one place long enough to build a life. "The law sided with you, surely. You were protecting a family." "The law in Laramie was bought and paid for by the same men who wanted Mrs. Patterson's land. The witness they found one of the men who ran claimed, "I shot an unarmed man in cold blood. Said I was trying to take the land for myself." Eli's laugh was bitter. A drifting carpenter with no money and no connections against 3 respected businessmen. Guess which story the law believed? Clara felt a surge of anger on his behalf. "So you've been running ever since?" "Running and building. Trying to do some good to balance the scales, I suppose." He gestured toward the nearly completed house. "Mrs. Patterson and her children are safe now, living with her sister in California. But these Menthe won't stop until they've made me pay for costing them that land deal." "What do they want?" "Money. Justice, they call it. But what they really want is to make an example of me. Show other folks what happens when you stand up to them." Eli crumpled the letter in his fist. "I should have moved on the moment I felt myself getting attached here. Should have known better than to think I could have this." "Have what?" "This." He gestured, encompassing the building site, the children, Clara herself. "A place to belong. People to care about who might care about me in return." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "A reason to stop running." Clara felt her heart breaking for this man who'd convinced himself he didn't deserve happiness, who'd spent 2 years building homes for others while denying himself the very thing he craved most. 3 days, she said, referring to the letter's deadline. "What happens in 3 days? They'll come for me, probably bring the law, make it look official, drag me back to Wyoming to face their version of justice." Eli straightened, his decision clearly made. "Which is why I need to be gone before then. Tonight, after the children are asleep." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Clara intended. "You're not running anymore." "Clara, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You're a good man who's been carrying guilt that isn't his to carry. You're someone who builds beautiful homes and teaches children and carves toys and treats everyone with kindness and respect." She stepped closer, her voice gaining strength. "And you're someone I've come to care about more than I ever expected to." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Eli's expression softened, hope and fear warring in his grey eyes. "Clara, we'll face this together," she continued firmly. "You, me, and this community that's already decided you're one of us. These men want to threaten our home, our family. Let them come. They'll find out what frontier justice really looks like when good people stand together." Eli stared at her as if she'd just proposed something impossible and wonderful and terrifying all at once. "You don't know what you're saying. These aren't men who play by civilized rules. Neither are we when it comes to protecting what matters." Clara touched his arm gently. "You've been alone with this for 2 years. You don't have to be alone anymore." Before Eli could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. 2 men on horseback were riding slowly down the main street, their eyes scanning the buildings and people with the systematic attention of hunters tracking prey. 3 days, Eli murmured, watching the riders pause outside the sheriff's office. "Looks like they're not planning to wait." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning frost. The confrontation she'd hoped to avoid was approaching faster than expected, and she found herself wondering if her brave words about community support would prove strong enough to protect the man she was beginning to love. That evening, as Clara prepared dinner in the cramped quarters behind the schoolhouse, she couldn't shake the image of the 2 riders who'd spent the afternoon asking questions around town. Their presence had cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration. The completion of the house's roof meant they were only days away from moving into their new home. Instead, Clara found herself wondering if Eli would even be there to see them settle in. She was stirring a pot of stew when she heard a soft knock at the back door. Through the window, she could see Eli's silhouette against the twilight, his hat in his hands, and his expression grave. "Mr. Boone," she said, opening the door, "the children have been asking about you. Ben wanted to show you how he practiced the joinery technique you taught him." "I need to talk to you privately," Eli said quietly, away from the children. Something in his tone sent alarm through Clara's chest. She grabbed her shawl and followed him outside, where the last light of day was fading behind the mountains. Those men who rode into town today. Eli began without preamble. I recognized one of them. Name's Jack Morisono, relation to your pastor. He was the witness in Laramie, one of the men who ran when his partner drew on me. Clara felt her stomach tighten. What does he want? To finish what they started 2 years ago, but that's not the worst part. Eli reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small object that gleamed silver in the fading light. I found this today, while I was working on the roof. It was hidden under some loose floorboards in the old storage shed behind the schoolhouse. Clara stared at the object in his Palmer delicate silver locket on a broken chain. Her breath caught as recognition hit her like a physical blow. That's mine. I thought I'd lost it when we moved from the house Thomas and I shared. She reached for the locket with trembling fingers. How did it get in the storage shed? Open it, Eli said gently. Clara pressed the tiny catch, and the locket sprang open to reveal a small formal portrait of her and Thomas on their wedding day. But tucked behind the photograph was something else, something that made her blood run cold. A folded piece of paper covered in Thomas's familiar handwriting. With shaking hands, she unfolded the note and read, "If anything happens to me, Clara should know the truth about the men who've been threatening us. Jack Morrison, Pete Crawford, and Sam Dalton from the Territorial Land Company. They've been forcing families to sell at unfair prices, using threats and violence. I've been documenting their activities, keeping records hidden in the old storage shed. They know I have evidence, and they've made it clear that my silence can be bought or taken. I pray this letter is never needed, but if you're reading it, then I've failed to protect the woman I love. The evidence is hidden with this letter. Use it well, Thomas." Clara's hands shook so violently that Eli had to steady the paper for her to finish reading. The implications hit her in waves. Thomas's death hadn't been a riding accident. The same men who were hunting Eli had killed her husband for trying to expose their crimes. "Clara," Eli's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, seeing his face through a haze of shock and grief and fury. Thomas was murdered. They killed him because he was trying to protect people like us families they were threatening and cheating. The evidence he mentioned, did you find it? Clara nodded numbly. A whole packet of documents, names, dates, recorded conversations, proof of everything they've been doing. She met Eli's eyes, understanding, dawning. "You witnessed Thomas's murder, didn't you? That's why they're really after you." Eli's silence was answer enough. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Eli had been in Laramie not just building houses, but searching for the men who'd killed Thomas. The shooting he'd been blamed for wasn't random violence. It was justice catching up with murderers. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara whispered. "Because I failed to save him," Eli said, his voice raw with old guilt. "I saw what happened. Saw them run his horse into that ravine, but I was too far away to stop it. By the time I reached him, Thomas was dying. All I could do was hold his hand while he asked me to find his wife and tell her he loved her." Clara felt tears streaming down her face as the truth of Thomas's final moments washed over her. He knew he was going to die. "He made me promise to find you, to make sure you were safe. I've been carrying that promise for 2 years, Clara. That's why I came to Dustwhistle, not for work, but to keep my word to a dying man." The revelation reframed everything Clara thought she knew about Eli's presence in their lives. His patience with the children, his dedication to building their house, his gentle care for her family, it all stemmed from a deathbed promise to her husband. So all of this, she gestured toward the construction site, was just obligation, guilt. "It started that way," Eli admitted, "but somewhere along the way it became something else. Somewhere between Ben's first carpentry lesson and Marcus's wooden horse and Sarah's daily flowers, I stopped building this house for Thomas and started building it for you, for all of you." Clara stared at him through her tears, trying to process the complex emotions swirling through her chest. Grief for Thomas, anger at the men who'd killed him, gratitude for Eli's protection, and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name. The men who are here now, they know about the evidence. Morrison suspected Thomas had documentation. That's why they killed him. They've been searching for it ever since, following any leads that might point them toward hidden records. Eli looked toward the schoolhouse, where lamplight glowed in the windows. If they find out you have ETIF, they realize Thomas was your husband, they'll do whatever it takes to get those documents back. Clara felt a chill that went deeper than the autumn air. The children, they're in danger because of me. They're in danger because bad men exist in this world, Eli corrected firmly. But we're not going to let anything happen to them. You asked me not to run anymore. I'm staying, Clara. Not just to finish the house, but to finish what Thomas started. To make sure these men face justice for what they've done. Clara looked at the locket in her hand, at the evidence of her husband's courage and the man who'd honored his dying wish. Two men, separated by death, but united in their determination to protect her family. What do? We fight back, but carefully, strategically. These men have shown they're willing to kill to protect their secrets. We need to be smarter than them, not just braver. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Ben emerged from the schoolhouse, his young face serious with concern. "Miss Clara, is everything all right? You've been gone a long time, and the little ones are asking about supper." Clara quickly wiped her tears and forced a smile. "Everything's fine, Ben. Mr. Boone and I were just discussing some final details about the house." But Ben's sharp eyes took in Eli's grim expression and Clara's obvious distress. At 14, he'd learned to read the signs of adult trouble, and he stepped closer protectively. "If there's something wrong, you can tell me. I'm not a little kid anymore." Eli and Clara exchanged a look, both recognizing the truth in Ben's words. He'd been forced to grow up fast, and trying to shield him from danger might actually put him at greater risk. "There might be some trouble coming," Eli said carefully. "Men who want to cause problems for good people. I need you to be extra watchful, Ben. Keep the younger children close, and if anything seems wrong, anything at all, you come find me or Miss Clara immediately." Ben nodded solemnly, accepting the responsibility with the gravity of someone much older. "Are we going to be safe?" "We're going to make sure you are," Clara said firmly. "All of us together." As they walked back toward the schoolhouse, Clara felt the weight of Thomas's locket against her palm and the warmth of Eli's presence beside her. The truth about the past had changed everything, but it had also clarified what really mattered. Protecting her family and ensuring that good people weren't destroyed by the greed and violence of others. The evidence Thomas had died to preserve was about to become their weapon in a fight that had been 2 years in the making, and this time they wouldn't be facing it alone. Saturday morning dawned grey and cold, with low clouds promising the first snow of the season. Clara woke before sunrise, her mind immediately returning to the revelations of the previous evening. Thomas's hidden evidence lay spread across her small table pages of meticulous documentation that painted a clear picture of the Territorial Land Company's criminal activities. Names, dates, witness accounts, even copies of forged documents used to steal property from frontier families. It was enough to bring down Morrison and his associates, if they could get it to the right authorities. The challenge was surviving long enough to do so. Eli arrived at first light, carrying a canvas bag that clinked softly with metal objects. Clara met him at the door, noting the grim determination in his expression. "I've been thinking about this all night," he said without preamble. "We have 2 advantages they don't know about. The evidence, and the fact that this community has decided to trust me, despite the rumors." "What do you mean?" "Harold Henderson stopped by my camp last night. Said he'd heard talk around town about trouble coming my way, and wanted me to know that decent folks in Dustwhistle don't abandon their friends." Eli set down his bag carefully. "Pastor Morrison, Pastor Morrison, not the snake who's hunting me's agreed to ride to Helena with copies of Thomas's evidence. If something happens to us, the territorial authorities will still get the truth." Clara felt a surge of gratitude for the community that had quietly rallied around them. "What about the children, if there's going to be trouble?" "Ben's taking them to the Morrison house this morning. The pastor's wife has agreed to watch them until this is settled. Eli's expression softened slightly. I won't let anything happen to your family, Clara. That's a promise I made to Thomas, and it's one I'm making to you. Before Clara could respond, the sound of multiple horses approached from the direction of town. Through the window, they could see 4 riders making their way toward the schoolhouse, more than the 2 men who'd arrived yesterday. They're bringing reinforcements, Eli observed grimly. Means they're planning to end this today. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but beneath the fear was a growing sense of righteous anger. These men had murdered her husband, threatened her children, and spent 2 years terrorizing innocent families. It was time for their crimes to catch up with them. Ben, she called toward the children's room. Time to go to the Morrison house. Quickly now. The children emerged with their small bundles of belongings, sensing the urgency, even if they didn't understand its source. Clara hugged each of them tightly, fighting back tears that might frighten them. We'll see you very soon, she promised Sarah, who clung to her with unusual intensity. Miss Clara, Marcus whispered, pressing his wooden horse into her hands. For luck, Mr. Boone taught me that good things happen when you believe in them. Clara's throat tightened as she accepted the carved toy. Even at 5 years old, Marcus understood that something important was happening, and his gesture of faith strengthened her resolve. Ben lingered after the others had started toward town, his young face grave with concern. Miss Clara, if those men try to hurt you or Mr. Boone, you'll do exactly what we've told you, Clara interrupted firmly. Keep the children safe and trust that we know what we're doing. After the children disappeared around the bend in the path, Clara and Eli stood alone beside the nearly completed house. The structure that had begun as simple shelter had become something much more significant, a symbol of hope, family, and the future they were fighting to protect. The key, Eli said, producing a small brass object from his pocket. I finished it last night. Thought you should be the one to hold it. Clara took the key to their new home, its weight both practical and symbolic. Engraved on its surface were the words, Boone Hollis Home, a declaration of partnership that made her breath catch. Eli, I know we haven't talked about what comes after, he said quickly. I know there are things that need to be discussed, decisions to be made. But I wanted you to know that if we get through this, if we survive what's coming, I'd like to stay, not just to finish the house, but to help fill it with the family it was meant to shelter. The declaration was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices. The 4 riders had reached the schoolhouse and were dismounting with the casual confidence of men who believed they held all the advantages. Eli Boone. The voice belonged to Jack Morrison, the witness whose lies had driven Eli into 2 years of exile. We know you're here. Time to face what you've got coming. Eli touched Clara's hand briefly, a gesture of comfort and determination. Stay inside unless I call for you. And Clara, no matter what happens, don't let them take Thomas's evidence. It's the only thing that can stop this from happening to other families. What about the key? Keep it. This house is yours, with or without me. Eli's smile was sad but genuine. You've already built the most important foundation, love, that turns strangers into family. The rest is just timber and stone. Clara watched from the window as Eli emerged from the schoolhouse, his hands visible but not raised in surrender. He walked with the steady confidence of a man who'd found something worth fighting for, and Clara realized that she was watching someone transform from a wandering builder into a protector choosing to make his stand. Morrison, Eli called back, his voice carrying across the space between them. Funny running into you here. Last I saw, you were running away from a fair fight. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't a fight, Morrison snarled. You murdered Pete Crawford in cold blood, and now you're going to pay for it. Crawford drew first, and we both know it. Just like we both know why you really killed Thomas Hollis. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Clara could see Morrison's companions shifting uncomfortably. Apparently not all of them knew the full extent of their leader's crimes. Don't know what you're talking about, Morrison replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Sure you do. Schoolteacher who was documenting your land-grabbing scheme, getting too close to the truth, so you made his death look like an accident. Eli took a step forward. Except it wasn't as clean as you thought. There were witnesses, Morrison, and evidence. Clara could see the calculation in Morrison's expression as he processed this information. His gaze moved from Eli to the schoolhouse, clearly wondering what proof might be hidden inside. Even if that were true, Morrison said slowly, dead men tell no tales, and you're going to be joining your friend very soon. Maybe, Eli agreed, but I won't be going alone. The threat was delivered with quiet certainty that made Morrison's companions exchange uncertain glances. Clara realized that Eli was deliberately provoking them, drawing their attention away from her and toward himself. From inside the schoolhouse, Clara could hear the conversation escalating toward violence. She clutched the house key in one hand and Marcus's wooden horse in the other, symbols of the life they were fighting to protect. Through the window, she watched Eli position himself strategically near the construction site, where tools and building materials might provide both weapons and cover. The confrontation that had been building for 2 years was finally at hand. Clara said a silent prayer for the man who'd honored her husband's dying wish by protecting their family, and who was now prepared to give his own life to ensure their safety. The first shot rang out just as the snow began to fall. The gunshot shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. Clara pressed herself against the schoolhouse wall, her heart hammering as she tried to see what was happening through the frost-covered window. The shot had come from one of Morrison's men, but it had gone wide, whether from nerves or poor aim, she couldn't tell. Eli had dove behind a stack of lumber near the house foundation, and she could see him moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been in dangerous situations before. His father's hammer, the same tool he'd used to build their home, was now gripped in his hand like a weapon. "That was your warning shot, Boone," Morrison shouted from behind his horse. "Next one finds its target. Come out peaceful, and we'll make this quick." "Like you made it quick for Thomas Hollis," Eli called back, his voice carrying clearly across the construction site. "Shot him in the back while he was trying to get home to his wife." Clara could see Morrison's face darken with anger. "Hollis was an accident. Horse spooked, threw him into the ravine." "Funny how many accidents happen to people who cross you," Eli replied. "How many families have you driven off their land with your accidents, Morrison?" From her position at the window, Clara could see that Morrison's 3 companions were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the conversation. These men had signed on for what they'd been told was a simple bounty collection, not an execution to cover up murder. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Ben, actually lowered his rifle slightly. "Jack, if what he's saying is true—" "Shut up, Tommy," Morrison snapped. "Man's a killer and a liar. Don't let him get in your head." But doubt had been planted, and Clara could see it spreading among the group. Eli was using words as effectively as weapons, forcing Morrison's allies to question what they'd gotten themselves into. "Tell you what, Morrison," Eli called out, rising slightly from behind his cover. "Let's settle this the way men should, just you and me, fair fight. Your companions can ride away clean, and the winner takes all." "You think I'm stupid enough to fall for that?" Morrison laughed harshly. "You've got backup coming. Whole town's probably riding out here by now." "No backup, just me and you, and the truth about what happened in Laramie." Eli stepped fully into view, his hands spread to show he wasn't holding a weapon. "Unless you're too yellow to face the man you've been hunting for 2 years." The challenge hit Morrison exactly where Eli had intended his pride. Clara could see the man's face flush with anger and embarrassment at being called a coward in front of his hired guns. "Fine," Morrison snarled, dismounting and drawing his pistol. "But when I put you down, I'm going to pay a visit to that schoolteacher lady. Make sure she doesn't have any inconvenient memories about her late husband." The threat against Clara seemed to flip a switch in Eli's demeanor. The careful strategist disappeared, replaced by something much more dangerous. Clara had never seen him move so fast as he lunged forward, covering the distance between them before Morrison could properly aim. Eli's hammer connected with Morrison's gun hand just as the pistol fired, sending the shot wild and the weapon spinning away into the snow. The two men crashed together in a tangle of fists and fury, rolling across the frozen ground near the house foundation. Morrison was younger and desperate, but Eli had the advantage of righteous anger and superior strength. Clara watched in terror and fascination as they fought with the intensity of men who knew only one of them would walk away. "Help him!" Morrison gasped to his companions as Eli's fist connected with his jaw. "Shoot him!" But the young man called Tommy had lowered his rifle completely. "This ain't what we signed up for, Jack. You said he was just a wanted killer, not someone fighting for his family." The other two men seemed torn between loyalty to Morrison and growing discomfort with the situation. Clara realized that Eli's strategy was working by forcing the confrontation into the open. He'd exposed the truth about Morrison's character and motivations. Morrison managed to break free from Eli's grip and scrambled toward where his gun had fallen. But Eli was faster, tackling him again before he could reach the weapon. This time, Morrison's head struck one of the foundation stones with a sickening crack. For a moment, everything went still. Morrison lay motionless in the snow, blood seeping from beneath his head. Eli knelt beside him, checking for signs of life with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "He's alive," Eli announced, looking up at Morrison's companions. "Unconscious, but breathing. He'll live to stand trial." Tommy and the other two men exchanged glances, clearly relieved that they wouldn't be accessories to murder. "What now?" Tommy asked uncertainly. "Now you help me tie him up, and we wait for the sheriff," Eli said, rising slowly from the ground. "Unless you want to explain to the territorial authorities how you helped a murderer hunt down witnesses." Clara could see the moment when Morrison's hired guns realized which side of this fight they wanted to be on. Tommy actually dismounted and approached Eli, with his hands raised peacefully. "We didn't know about the murder," he said earnestly. "Morrison told us you'd killed his partner and jumped bail, said it was a legal bounty hunt." "I figured as much," Eli replied, accepting the young man's surrender. "Good men don't usually ride with killers when they know the truth." As the immediate danger passed, Clara emerged from the schoolhouse on shaking legs. The confrontation that had haunted Eli for 2 years was finally over, and somehow they'd survived it with their principles intact. Eli looked up as she approached, his storm-grey eyes reflecting relief and something deeper, the look of a man who'd finally stopped running from his past and was ready to build a future. Clara reached Eli just as Morrison began to stir in the snow, his eyes unfocused and blood still trickling from the gash on his head. The man who had terrorized so many families looked smaller now, defeated and pathetic rather than threatening. "Easy there," Eli said as Morrison tried to sit up. "You took a hard knock. Best stay still until the sheriff arrives." "This isn't over," Morrison mumbled through swollen lips. "You think one fight settles 2 years of running? There are othersmen with more resources than you can imagine." "Maybe," Eli agreed calmly, helping Tommy secure Morrison's hands with rope from the construction supplies. "But they'll have to get through Thomas Hollis's evidence first. Turns out your victims were better at keeping records than you thought." Morrison's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You don't have anything. Hollis died before he could." "Before he could what?" Clara stepped forward, Thomas's locket gleaming in her palm. "Before he could hide documentation of every crime you've committed. Names, dates, witness statements, even copies of the forged papers you used to steal land." The color drained from Morrison's face as he realized the scope of his defeat. "You're bluffing. Thomas was just a schoolteacher." "Thomas was my husband," Clara said with quiet dignity, "and he died protecting people like us from people like you. But his work didn't die with him." She opened the locket, revealing the photograph that had started it all. He hid the evidence where you'd never think to look, in the memories and keepsakes of the woman who loved him. You spent 2 years searching for papers that were right under your nose. Morrison's remaining companions shifted uncomfortably as the full picture became clear. They'd been hunting an innocent man while helping cover up crimes that had destroyed dozens of families. "Sheriff's coming," Tommy announced, pointing toward a group of riders approaching from town. "Looks like he brought a posse." Clara recognized Sheriff Crawford among the riders, along with Pastor Morrison and several other men from Dustwhistle. Behind them rode a figure she didn't expect, a woman in traveling clothes who carried herself with obvious authority. "That's Deputy Marshal Catherine Wells," Eli said with surprise. "From Helena. Must be Pastor Morrison made good time with those copies." As the law enforcement party approached, Clara felt a mixture of relief and vindication. The evidence Thomas had died protecting was finally going to see justice served. Deputy Marshal Wells dismounted with businesslike efficiency, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, Morrison bound and bloodied, his companions standing with their weapons lowered, Eli and Clara waiting calmly beside the construction site. "Mr. Boone, I presume?" she said, extending her hand. "Deputy Marshal Wells, I've been looking forward to meeting the man who's been carrying Thomas Hollis's evidence all this time." "Actually, ma'am, the evidence was with Mrs. Hollis. I was just trying to keep my promise to her husband." Eli's correction was gentle but importante, wanted no credit for Thomas's courage. Wells turned to Clara with obvious respect. "Mrs. Hollis, your husband's documentation is the most comprehensive case we've seen against territorial land fraud. These men are going to face federal charges for their crimes." Morrison tried to speak, but Wells silenced him with a sharp look. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Hollis and conspiracy to defraud territorial landowners. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." As Wells and Sheriff Crawford secured the prisoners, Clara found herself standing beside Eli in the growing snowfall. The confrontation that had driven him to wander for 2 years was finally over, but she could see uncertainty in his expression. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now you're safe. You and the children can live in your new house without fear." Eli gestured toward the nearly completed building. "Morrison's organization will collapse once the federal authorities start prosecuting. Other families will get justice too." "That's not what I meant." Eli was quiet for a long moment, watching the lawmen prepare Morrison and his associates for transport to Helena. "I know what you meant," he said finally. "I'm just not sure I know the answer." Before Clara could respond, the sound of children's voices drew their attention. Ben was leading the younger children down the path from town, their faces bright with excitement and relief at seeing Clara and Eli unharmed. "Miss Clara," Sarah called out, running ahead of the group, "Pastor Morrison said the bad men are caught. Does that mean we can move into our house now?" Clara caught Sarah in a fierce hug, feeling the warmth of her small body against the cold air. "Yes, sweetheart, we can move into our house." Marcus approached more shyly, his eyes darting between Clara and Eli. "Miss Clara, did my lucky horse help?" "Very much," Clara assured him, pressing the carved toy back into his small hands. "Your horse helped us remember what we were fighting for." As the children gathered around them, chattering excitedly about the house and the snow and the adventure of staying with the pastor's family, Clara noticed Eli watching them with an expression she'd learned to recognize. It was the look of a man memorizing a moment he expected to lose. "Eli," she said softly, drawing him aside while Ben organized the children for a tour of their nearly finished home. "You promised me honesty. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that promises can be complicated things," he replied, his gray eyes reflecting the falling snow. "I promised Thomas I'd keep you safe. I've done that. Maybe it's time to let you build the life you deserve without the complications I bring." "And what if the life I deserve includes those complications?" Clara met his gaze directly. "What if the family we've built together is exactly what I choose?" Before Eli could answer, Ben called out from the house foundation, "Mr. Boone, look what I found." They turned to see Ben holding something that gleamed in the winter light, a small metal object that had been embedded in one of the foundation stones during the fight. "It's Morrison's bullet," Ben announced proudly, "the one that went wild when you tackled him. It's stuck right in the cornerstone of our house." Clara and Eli exchanged a look, both recognizing the symbolism. The cornerstone that Eli had laid with such care now bore the mark of the battle they'd fought to protect their home. It would remain there forever, a reminder that sometimes the strongest foundations are forged in struggle and tested by fire. "Leave it there," Eli said quietly. Some scars are worth keeping. 3 weeks later, Clara stood in the kitchen of their completed home, morning sunlight streaming through windows that perfectly framed the view of Willow Creek. The house that had begun as simple shelter had become something far more precious, a sanctuary, built with love, tested by adversity, and strengthened by the bonds forged in its creation. The brass nameplate beside the front door read, "The Boone Hollis Home," in elegant script, a declaration that had surprised exactly no one in Dustwhistle when Eli had finally admitted what everyone else had known for weeks. He was staying. The wandering builder had found his home not in timber and stone, but in the laughter of children and the love of a woman who understood that some foundations take time to build properly. Clara was preparing breakfast when she heard familiar voices from the main room, Ben teaching little Marcus the proper way to measure lumber, using the techniques Eli had patiently shown him. Through the doorway, she could see Eli himself in the wooden rocking chair he'd crafted with extraordinary care. Sarah curled up in his lap as he read from one of the new books that had arrived on yesterday's supply wagon. And the family lived happily ever after in their beautiful new home, Eli concluded, closing the book gently. "Tell another one," Emma pleaded from her spot on the braided rug. After chores, Clara called from the kitchen, smiling at the predictable chorus of groans that followed. "And after Mr. Boone finishes the last of the built-in shelves in the boys' room." The domestic routine still felt wonderfully new to her, the luxury of space for everyone, proper beds and warm rooms, a kitchen large enough for the whole family to gather for meals. But more than the physical comforts, it was the sense of completeness that overwhelmed her. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like they were truly home. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway, ducking slightly to avoid the frame as he always did. At 6 feet 8 inches, he made their new house feel cozy rather than spacious. But Clara had learned to love the way his presence filled their rooms. "Coffee's ready," she announced, pouring him a cup from the pot on their new iron stove. "Thank you." He accepted the cup with a smile that still made her heart flutter. "Ben's getting good with those measurements. Boy has natural instincts for building." "He's had an excellent teacher." Clara moved closer, straightening the collar of his shirt in the unconscious gesture of long intimacy. "Speaking of teaching, Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday. The school board has officially approved our expanded curriculum. Starting next month, you'll be teaching carpentry and practical skills 3 days a week." Eli's expression grew thoughtful. "Still, can't quite believe they want me as a teacher. Man who never stayed anywhere long enough to see his work appreciated." Times change. People change. Clara touched the wedding ring on her left hand, not Thomas's ring, which now rested in the locket near her heart, but a new band that Eli had fashioned himself from gold found in the creek. "Besides, you've been teaching Ben for weeks. This just makes it official." The sound of horses approaching drew their attention to the front window. Clara recognized Deputy Marshal Wells's distinctive bay gelding, along with 2 other riders she didn't know. "Wonder what brings the law back to Dustwhistle," Eli mused, setting down his coffee cup. They met Wells on the front porch, where the deputy marshal greeted them with uncharacteristic warmth. The past month had transformed her from a suspicious federal officer into something approaching a friend. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone Hollis," she said with a slight smile at the hyphenated name they'd chosen. "I bring good news from Helena. Morrison and his associates have been convicted on all federal charges. They'll be spending the next 20 years in territorial prison." Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd still been carrying. "And the families they cheated?" "Restitution has been ordered. The territorial government is working to restore stolen lands and provide compensation for damages." Wells gestured toward her companions. "These gentlemen are from the land office. They have paperwork for you." The older of the 2 men stepped forward with a manila envelope. "Mrs. Boone Hollis, your late husband's documentation was instrumental in prosecuting these cases. The territorial government wants to offer you a position as a special investigator, someone who can help other families document and report similar crimes." Clara looked at Eli, seeing pride and encouragement in his grey eyes. What would that involve? Travel to settlements where fraud is suspected, help families gather evidence, coordinate with federal authorities. The position comes with a substantial salary and housing allowances for your family. The man glanced toward the house, where the children's voices could be heard through the open windows. Your experience and Mr. Boone's construction expertise would be invaluable in identifying false documentation and fraudulent property claims. It was an opportunity Clara had never imagined, a chance to honor Thomas's legacy while building a future that used both her skills and Eli's. But it would mean leaving their beautiful new home, uprooting the children again, returning to a life of uncertainty. "We'll need time to consider it," Eli said diplomatically. "This is home now, and that means something to all of us." After the officials departed with promises to return in a week for their answer, Clara and Eli sat on their front porch watching the children play in the yard. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and the willow trees whispered secrets to the wind. "What do you think?" Clara asked finally. "I think Thomas would be proud of you either way," Eli replied honestly. "And I think those children deserve a say in what happens to their family." That evening, after dinner and evening chores, the whole family gathered in the main room for what Eli called a family meeting. The children arranged themselves on the braided rug, while Clara and Eli took their chairs by the fireplace. "We've been offered a job," Clara began carefully. "Important work that would help protect other families from bad men like the ones we faced. But it would mean traveling, living in different places for months at a time." "Like being pioneers?" Sarah asked with excitement. "Something like that," Eli confirmed. "But it would also mean leaving this house, at least sometimes, missing the home we've all worked so hard to build." Ben, ever practical, asked the important question. "Would we be together, all of us?" "Always," Clara assured him. "Whatever we decide as a family." Marcus raised his hand solemnly. "I vote for staying here. This house has the best hiding spots for treasure." Emma disagreed. "I want to see new places and help other kids like us." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with each child expressing their thoughts and concerns. Clara marveled at their wisdom even at their young ages. They understood both the security of home and the importance of helping others. Finally, Ben spoke for the group. "We think we should take the job," he announced seriously. "But only if we can always come back here. This will always be our real home, right?" Clara and Eli exchanged a look across the room, the wordless communication of two people who'd learned to trust each other completely. "Always," Eli confirmed. "No matter where our work takes us, this will always be where we belong." 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of a half-built cabin in Colorado Territory, watching Eli teach a grateful homesteader the proper technique for laying foundation stones. Their investigation had uncovered another fraud ring, and 3 more families would keep their land because of Thomas's evidence and their combined efforts. The work was challenging and important, taking them to remote settlements across the frontier. But true to their promise, they always returned to Dustwhistle, to the house by Willow Creek, where brass nameplate gleamed in the sun and the cornerstone still bore the mark of the battle they'd won together. In her pocket, Clara carried the key to their home, not just the metal object Eli had crafted, but the understanding that home wasn't about walls and roofs. It was about the people who chose to shelter each other's hearts, the family built from love and commitment rather than blood and obligation. As evening approached and Eli finished his work, Clara watched their children playing in the mountain meadow beyond the construction site. Ben was teaching Marcus to whittle. Sarah was braiding wildflowers into Emma's hair, and Jenny was reading aloud from a book of poetry. They were exactly what Thomas had dreamed. They could be family, united by love, strengthened by adversity, and dedicated to protecting others from the darkness they'd once faced. Eli joined her in the doorway, his arms settling around her waist with the comfortable intimacy of 2 people who'd found their perfect fit. "Ready to head home?" he asked softly. Clara leaned into his warmth, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Home was wherever this man and these children were, but she knew he meant the house they'd built together, the place where their love story had taken root and grown into something beautiful and enduring. Always, she replied, echoing the promise they'd made to each other and to the family they'd chosen to shelter. Always ready to go home. And in the distance, carried on the evening wind, she could almost hear the whisper of willow trees, calling them back to the sanctuary they'd built with their own hands and filled with their own hearts, a home that would stand as long as love remained strong enough to weather any storm.